topic is on Anna Freud and her post-World War II studies. So just some brief information on Anna Freud. So she was initially a school teacher and she turned a psychoanalyst. She was born in 1895 and she passed away in 1982. The name Freud might sound familiar to you, and she's indeed the youngest daughter of Sigmund Freud. Anna, in her own right, however, is considered one of the mothers of psychoanalysis, alongside another psychoanalyst named Melanie Klein, and they basically developed their whole life, dedicated their whole life to psychoanalysis, and that's why they are considered the mothers of psychoanalysis. Some of the accomplishments we'll be talking about Anna. She founded the psychoanalytic study of the child in 1945. This was shortly after World War II. She opened the Hampstead Child Therapy course, and a couple years later she ended up opening the Hampstead Child Therapy Clinic, which is actually still there today, it's just a different name. And then she published Normality and Pathology, which spoke on child upbringing and how parental guidance affects their eventual development as children. So just a brief introduction of psychoanalysis. Obviously, psychoanalysis was founded by her father, Sigmund Freud. However, Anna Freud, who is his daughter, followed in the footsteps of her father by contributing basically her whole life to child psychoanalysis. What psychoanalysis does is it aims to release emotions and feelings that are pent up or tangled. So as this diagram shows right here, the top of the iceberg represents the conscious mind, and the components such as the ego, the superego, and the id are actually making up what is the unconscious mind. So what psychoanalysis is aiming to do is it's bringing these emotions from the unconscious into the conscious state. And what Anna really did with that is, with children, she aimed to use psychoanalysis to help children not only develop as children to have good outcomes as adults, but after World War II, there was a lot of trauma that the children faced, so she mostly dedicated her studies to helping those children overcome war trauma. So now child psychoanalysis is considered a subfield of psychoanalysis, and it's specifically designed to match the needs of a child. And the importance of child psychoanalysis is that it needs to meet the needs of a child, whereas the needs of an adult are completely different. You can't handle the two the same, or children may leave with more trauma from therapy. Repression is a very big thing in child psychoanalysis, and what it is it's an attempt for children to avoid unwanted memories, feelings, and emotions, is because they don't know how to handle it, whereas adults are more mature and their mind is more developed, rather than children where they don't even recognize that they have issues. So one thing that Anna very much so added to like her curriculum with child psychoanalysis is she allowed children to roam freely, like in clinic rooms and stuff, because of their inability to focus and sit like adults. Whereas today, if you go into like a therapy session room or like a clinic, you'll see mostly like a therapist and then the client sitting there. Whereas for children, they can't sit still like that, or they will get flustered and they won't be able to progress or develop. So it was very key that she allowed children to roam freely and essentially be children. So in modern contemporary psychotherapy, it's combined with child psychoanalysis and parent-oriented tasks, which have had long-lasting effects on modern mental health services. Like I mentioned, if you go into any mental health service today, you'll see a lot of these teachings implemented. Like you'll see a lot of kids, and you'll see a lot of free play, a lot of just open space, because they are not able to focus like adults. So the psychoanalytic study of the child, it focused mainly on adolescents and children, and obviously it focused on their suffering from mental health struggles. I pulled a quote from this, and it stated, "The future of our society will depend on the capacity of our children to withstand ever-morning tensions in the world of today and tomorrow. Adequately to do so, this requires both genuine understanding of the mental and psychic development of the child gained through psychoanalysis." When dealing with these children, it was after World War II, so a lot of the kids had war trauma, which you couldn't just not pay attention to it, and then you couldn't treat it as just regular trauma, because they did see some things that no child should see. And basically what this means is that post-war societies and just societies to come, it pretty much depended on their ability to withstand the war trauma and develop through it, because if you just didn't treat these kids, a bunch of the kids growing up in the next generation would just all have untreated war trauma, and it would not lead to good successes and adult outcomes. So after the war in 1947, Anna founded the Hampstead Training Course, and a couple years later she opened her own clinic, and it was known as the Hampstead Training Clinic. This is actually recognized as Anna Freud's greatest achievement in her work towards children through psychoanalysis. And some things that it provided were treatment, research, and training through psychoanalysis, and obviously aim for children. Something very key that she mentioned was that children's minds represent kind of a public property, and this is very accurate because children's minds are very susceptible and very vulnerable, whereas although adults can be very vulnerable as well, they are more aware of their emotions and their feelings, and they will be aware if they have some trauma, whereas children will not be aware at all. So yeah, something I pulled from this source was that children's minds function to a sense where they quite often have no idea that they are ill and want no help from analysts and are in the midst of growth. Especially when children are in development, they have no idea really like what their emotions are, what their feelings are. So this is why Anna's contributions to specifically child psychoanalysis were so important. So in Normality and Pathology, she really focused in on talking about infancy through adolescence, and it spoke on the effects of childhood experience leaving lasting effects on adulthood. And in this case, she spoke a lot about children in the post-war society, and it talked about their developmental process as children and adolescents to eventual adult outcomes. So another quote I pulled from this is that, "In our work time with children during the war, we had many occasions to observe those who had experienced not their own real separation distress, but imagined stress, loneliness, and the longing of the mother they left behind." So a lot of the times, some of the children that she was working with didn't even necessarily go through their own trauma, as they would be so affected by like the hysteria of trauma, or by seeing like their peers or their neighborhoods affected, and it would affect them so greatly that although they didn't individually experience it, it still affected them very hard. So yeah, so for children of post-war societies, their developmental effects were considered abnormal, and they needed treatments in order to progress and make it through post-war recoveries in society. So Anna's lasting influence on psychology, obviously she founded child psychoanalysis, but she also contributed to ego and adolescent psychology. She promoted parental guidance and influenced parents' child development. Like I mentioned earlier, the Hampstead Child Therapy Clinic is still open and standing today, but it is known as the Anna Freud National Center for Children and Families, and it is actually a child mental health treatment center. And some other things that she very especially did is she separated children from adult development, leaving child psychoanalysis being unique in its own right and specifying it for children. That's all I have. Have any questions?
You might have answered this already, but what drew Anna's attention to children?
So obviously her father was very heavily into psychoanalysis, and what drew her to children was she was a school teacher, so she loved working with children, and she just kind of saw vulnerability in them, especially after World War II, and saw that in order to help the future generations, she needed to help the kids that faced war trauma because they couldn't process it the same as adults could.
Where did the children come from in her initial study?
In her initial study, they came from like what part of the world?
Yeah, like how did she get them? Like were they Great Britain children? Were they?
They were children who, well, the first one were kids who suffered. I know one of them was from like survivors of like concentration camps and stuff. And then she kind of just opened it to the public of anyone suffering from war trauma, and then kind of just welcomed them all in. I could research more about like more studies specifically for that and get back to you.